I suppose, the stories were written over so many years that if you look at them, you can obviously chart my progression as a writer. You can see different influences I labored under at different periods. I'm sure preoccupations emerge from it. Most of which I'm not conscious of, because sometimes I would write a short story and then be working on a novel for a couple of years and then have a bit of a time and write another short story, so things would reappear or recur, and I wouldn't be aware of it because of the passage of time. So I think it's probably, if you wanted to know about what I was going through in the last 20 to 30 years as a historian or a psychologist, you could probably use the stories as a map or as a guidepost. Well, I included everything that was published in a magazine. I have lots of short stories that I didn't finish, or lost interest in, or I couldn't figure out how to write them. So those are in my drawers and in computer files in my computer. But they're shards and fragments of different ideas. All the stories I completed are in this book. Well, they're the most recent short stories, and I want something, something to be in the book that readers haven't seen before.
Yeah.
So I didn't just want it to be old work. I wanted some new work and sense of what I've been doing lately. And those are the longest stories in the collection, and in many ways, I think the deepest and the most expansive. So I wanted them as a counterweight to some of the earlier stories. Well, Mitchell Grammaticus is becoming something of an alter ego for me whenever I'm writing close to my own experience, about a kid that grew up in Detroit who's half Greek and half Irish. Mitchell Grammaticus is usually that character. When I first published Airmail, he had a different name. His name was Mitchell Carambolus in the first version. And then I forgot about that and wrote the marriage plot, and then realized that his name was so close that I might as well tidy it up. He's the same character on the same trip, with the same interest in religion and the same upbringing. So he really is the same person. There's no reason to pretend he's a different character. I've noticed that I often, in the short stories and in my novels, spend a lot of time describing what the characters are reading. I guess I think that reading is commensurate with experience, and what people are reading or thinking about influences their behavior, and to just cut that out and to act as though you can adequately explain someone's life without the imaginative material they're consuming isn't quite adequate. With the marriage plot, I was really concentrating on the idea that we get a lot of ideas about romance from the novel, and that influences real decisions in our lives. There's this crazy show in America right now that I watch with fascination and horror. It's called 90 Day Fiance. It's a reality television show. And it's people who fall in love with someone in a different country. They often don't know them very well. Sometimes they don't speak their language. And they get a 90-day visa for that person to come to the United States. They have to get married within those 90 days, or they won't actually be able to stay. And you watch the lunacy that infects people in connection with romance. They have, the less they know about the person, the more strongly they feel that they're in love with that person. It's that kind of idea that is often aided and abetted by literature and by the movies, that where you're waiting for Mr. or Mrs. Right to appear on the scene. So that's what I was talking about with the marriage plot and the danger of reading. With this book, with this short story, Complainers, it's about a friendship between two women. One of the women is slightly younger, and the older woman is now suffering from dementia. And the medicine that the book is providing is mental stimulation, helping her mind stay sharp, and also reacquainting her with this book that they both loved. So in that way, I mean, for me, I think books are more medicine than danger. I mean, they really provide me with you know, a motive for living and a reason to live. And most of the time, if I find a good book, it's elevating to my spirits. So I think reading is dangerous. It fills me full of crazy ideas, but I actually think it's more of a medicine, at least for me. That's a description of the way my mother read books. Sometimes she would tell me about a book and the story, and she wouldn't remember who had written it. She had certain favorite authors, but that's just descriptive of my mother's reading practice. No, I always remember who the writer is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, because it's a different. For me, it's a profession and a competition, right? So I pay attention to. The Oracular Vulva is the only story in the collection that didn't begin as a proper short story. The rest of them were conceived as short stories and are short stories. The Oracular Vulva is an outtake from Middlesex. When I was writing it from a different point of view, I was writing large sections of the book from the point of view of the sexologist Peter Luce. When I changed the novel, a certain amount of material was no longer tenable. I threw away a couple hundred pages of that manuscript. At the same time, the New Yorker was coming up with their edition, 20 writers under 40.
Oh yeah.
And they needed something to put in the magazine. And I was writing Middlesex. I wasn't writing any short stories. I had nothing new. And so I said, well, I have these sections of the manuscript that are no longer useful to me, and so I looked in them and I took the Oracular Vulva out, which sort of stands as its own little episode of a sexologist going to this tribe in Papua New Guinea and doing some work. So that's how that became a short story. And then I wondered if I should include it in the collection. Discussed it with my editor, and we decided to put it in because it underscores certain material I've worked with before, that ideas about gender and construction of gender and anthropological behavior relating to third gender categories, things that I've written about. So we included it in the collection.
Yeah.
I think it was 2005. It was before the crash. Anyway, I wrote it long before the crisis.
Yeah, okay.
I wrote it during the crazy period before, where everyone was making money in the stock market. It says 2008 too. It must have been early in the year, like January or something.
Yeah, March.
Almost 2000. March.
March in New York.
That's 5 months before the crash.
Yeah.
It's funny because I remember it being written earlier, but I guess a couple of years might have passed before it came out. It probably is a result of the fact that I never try to write about politics or have a moment that I want to describe. If I wanted to write about President Trump or something like that, I would write an op-ed and make a rational argument. I don't think fiction is the best vehicle for that. So I write about people and I see what they're going through, and then because of that, if I examine that, it will have political and economic implications. You'll realize what's going on in the economy and what's happening out in the national stage. Hopefully, if you do that, the statement you make or the reality that you render is one that's going to be relevant, not just at one particular moment, but at different times. Booms and bust cycles in economics, different administrations in the White House. These things recur. People forget now how people were feeling about George W. Bush as president because we have Trump. Now, it suddenly seems like that was a good period. But if you remember how people were during George W. Bush, a lot of people weren't happy about it. Same thing with Ronald Reagan. So you can write about those periods, and it'll be relevant often. Unfortunately, comes back again and again. You always begin with a short story because it's short. It's you're going to be able to finish it, and you can't tell a beginning writer to write a novel. They don't have the capacity to write a novel. That implies that a novel's harder. It's not necessarily the case, because to write a good short story, a perfect short story, is extremely difficult. You can't really make any mistakes. So it's the precision of it and getting everything to work in such a short space is quite difficult. The novel's a more forgiving form. You can try different things. Maybe not everything has to be perfect, and the novel will still move along and maybe not even be a disaster. But I usually say it's harder to write a short story. It's a strange fact that we begin teaching young writers with short stories because it's so hard. It's like if they were Olympic divers, we would be telling them their first dive has to be a triple flip, double whatever dives are, instead of just jumping off and doing a belly flop. But it's practical. You have to start with short stories because you don't want to read 200 pages of a novice writer's writing. They need to learn how to write sentences and how to move paragraphs along and get some sense of their abilities. So they're both extremely hard. I mean, writing is extremely hard, and writing a good book is hard. So I don't know which is worse, in terms of difficulty. Yeah, I do. Publishers don't love both forms as much. They like novels better. And I have to say that in terms of interviews, novels are easier to talk about because you have one subject, and with a book of short stories, you have to jump around. So it gives both interviewer and interviewee more difficulty to make a coherent discussion.
Yeah,
The beginning of that story is if you're so smart, how come you're not rich? Right? So that's a very American statement. You're supposed to use your brain to get ahead in life and make some money, and Americans can be suspicious of people who have expertise and yet lack any visible sign of betterment from it. That's why they distrust intellectuals and professors, because they don't make a lot of money. So who says they're so smart, And that story is about someone who's intelligent and wanted to be a poet and works as an editor, and yet is being left behind by the booming economy, and begins to wonder himself, like, if I'm so smart, why are these other guys driving Range Rovers and I'm not? Why can I not pay the heating bill and things like that? So he gets driven to a life of crime. It's, I guess, maybe just a fantasy that I had. What would drive a person like me, a bookish person, to enter the realm of America where there's a lot of corruption and scheming. I mean, we see it so much right now in the American government now with Trump and his cronies. So many stories of corruption and money laundering and all this stuff that's going on. Like that's going on, and you know, you have Paul Manafort laundering money through Cyprus, and how much of that is going on, and how little the people I know about that sort of thing. You know, trying to make a living in the publishing industry or through teaching or whatever they do. You know, it fascinates me that you have all these smart people living in a certain way, and you have these other guys manipulating huge sums of money. Like who is really got the power and who has the smarts, and this character gets caught up thinking maybe it's the bad guys that actually are the smart ones and I'm the dumb one, and he tries to see what'll happen if he goes over to the other side. There's obviously a big emotional attachment to money, and people derive their sense of meaning and sense of significance through money. A lot of these stories are about people who've lost money, who've made money and lost it, or who've never had any and lost it. It's something that I've been well acquainted with in my life. My mother grew up extremely poor, and my father didn't have very much money. And my father made a lot of money, and then he lost most of his money. So I saw a lot of changing fortunes in my life, and was acquainted both with wealth and with poverty. And I've seen how quickly that happens and what it does to people. So I could see that the preoccupation with that runs through the whole book. I write about houses all the time, and my father was a mortgage banker, and his business was getting people to buy houses. And when I was young, we grew up in large, stable houses that I think provided me with some sense of the way the world was organized. I still think of the world and a family as housed in some larger structure with various rooms, and I could almost describe most of my novels as houses. Middlesex refers to intersex narrator, but it also refers to the street and the house that the character grows up in, a modernist prairie style house. So architecture has always been important in my books. If I were smart about the real estate market, I actually bought a very big house a month before the financial crisis, which was worth quite a bit less a month after I bought it, and never really came back. I understand houses as a psychological and emotional kind of dream of contentment and perfection and comfort, and I also see them as an illusion. I've gotten over it now. Now I'm a renter. I sold that house and live on a much smaller scale. But I did have this dream in my life to finally get back and have a house like the one that my father had when I was growing up. Some sort of deep compulsion to get back to the level we had. But I'm over that now.
And you live in New York now?
I live in New York, in a much smaller apartment. So. That my stories are about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, so everyone's stories are about that in one way or another, at least some kind of coupling. That story was written in 1995, so I think that probably just referring to the confused and uncertain state that men have in society right now. You can see with the Me Too movement, like, are men supposed to be dashing devils that are seductive, or are they supposed to be completely, benign and retreating and never saying anything? No, men don't know how to act anymore. They're frightened at every moment. So that's the kind of situation they're in. Also, it's an insemination party where the women are really acting up, in a sense, taking power over their production and their sexuality, and the men are quite uncertain how to behave around this. Should they be amused by it? Should they be threatened by it? So I was trying to get at some of those ideas. Not at all. No. Not at all.
Okay, because I wonder. Because you're so ironic, I wondered if...
No, I never use names to mean anything except it sounds like the right name for the person.
Yeah.
They never have... Even grammaticus, it means teacher, but I didn't think about that. I never use names consciously as having a meaning. No, I don't think they're all dark. I think the first story, Complainers, is not a dark story. It's got some dark material because the woman is getting older, but it's really about her friendship and her the meaning of this friendship and the meaning of her life. It's not completely a happy portrait of her marriage or her life, but it ends on a note of transcendence that for me is represents a measure of optimism or fullness. Some of the stories are indeed very dark. I agree with you. Most of the stories of the men who are married are difficult times in their either marriages or their financial lives. But I don't. When you say irony, I could be taking it wrong. But my attitude throughout the book, from the early stories to the later stories, is a movement away from irony and a movement toward fully appreciating the predicaments that the characters are in, not making fun of them, not using them as merely comedic figures. There might be, I have a humorous disposition, so the stories do have humor in them. Some are bitingly comic, like Baster, but in general, I think as I've aged, I've found that irony is insufficient as a response to life. Life is more serious and somber and deeper than an ironic one. The ironic position is more of a young man's or young person's attitude, where you feel kind of superior to people. And I think maybe there's a little bit of that in some of the early stories. In comedy, you can, of course, make fun of people, and I think people are absurd now too, and I can make fun of them. But if I really want to get invested in a character and in a story, I don't want to remain superior or detached in a way that would be purely ironic. I think that in dramatic fiction, you often don't want to know where the author stands. The burden of fiction is to marshal together different characters with different points of view, and to let them play out their battles and their dramas without taking sides morally, because that just simplifies the fiction, so that you can get a moral or a point of it. The last story, for instance, Fresh Complaint, tries to paint a complex portrait of a moment of what might be called sexual predation, but it complicates it to a degree where you're not sure who's the victim. Is everyone the victim? What sorts of forces are coming together to make this? So I usually try to look for situations that aren't easily adjudicated in terms of a simple moral point. And for that reason, I guess there's a kind of irony or detachment from the authorial perspective, because I'm not coming in and telling you what you should think. Well, I don't know if they're serious. I mean, it's in terms of find the bad guy, it's his speculation about how birds sing, and I think he's kind of serious about it. He's trying to figure out if it's true. I don't know. I obviously you can look at the natural world and make correlations between human behavior and animals. But in those instances, I think I'm using it mainly in a comedic fashion. That's a kind of that would be the kind of observation or statement that someone who's not me would be able to make and decide. I know when I was thinking about the pleasant absurdity of America, I believe I was talking about Florida and the strange things that you see there, like a bar with a shark behind the tank, and the various tourist extravaganzas that you come upon. So I was thinking about it in pretty small scale, in that way. I think in general, the feeling of the book, at least in terms of stories like Great Experiment, is not to think of the American experiment as an absurdity, but as something of great value, that is in peril, or has lost its direction, or is in danger of losing its direction. America beginning with the Enlightenment ideals that it inherited from France and other European countries, and then trying to perfect those in a situation where you didn't have a feudal society, but you had, at least at the beginnings, one where there was more equality of condition, and trying to start a new world with Enlightenment ideals, but under different circumstances. That still is meaningful to me, and the opposite of absurd. So the book is often concerned with trying to resuscitate that, or reclaim it, and try to see how it could be restored, at least to a certain degree. It's not so different in a way than some things I hear in former President Obama's speeches, when he tries to see a long view of the United States and reclaim some of these early ideas and use them to shape our present and our future. That's the kind of the battle that goes on politically in the country. What is the meaning of the country, and how can we use that to make our decisions now? And then there's the countervailing feeling that the whole thing is a circus, right? And just absurd, and then you throw up your hands at it. I guess I would think that was an abdication of citizenship, just to give in to the circus and decide that the craziness that we see right now is inevitable, and there's no resisting against it, and all you can do is laugh. I guess it was I was reading it at the time and thinking about it, and the story was partly inspired by the reading of it. Just as we began the discussion today, I mean, books are experiences, and reading that book was my experience of living in Chicago, and it affected the way I thought about the world. So it was important to me, but it also, when I write a short story, I have a character who's not like me, and I have to think, what does he know? What is he reading? And in this case, Democracy in America was what that character was reading. In the other story, Early Music, he plays the harpsichord, and I had to learn a lot about early music in order to write that story. So I'll do a certain amount of diving into new material when I'm working on a story to find out what I need to know for that story. Each story should have its own province of ideas, and it's not the same thing again and again. So the Tocqueville was the reigning deity in that story, and while I was writing it, I was immersing myself in de Tocqueville, but it's not as though I'm always reading de Tocqueville, or I know that, or I even know that book that well, or remember it. At the time I was reading it, that was 10 years ago. I don't know. You're the French person. You have to tell me.
You don't
We never know what it's going to
Your
be.
work, I mean. So that was my answer.
I hope that's not the case, because that means no one will know it in America. I don't know right at the moment what it is, but I'm sure there's something that the French are liking about America that we don't appreciate. Yeah.